Welcome to Analytically Delicious, Insights into Food Safety by LVA. Join us as we explore the latest developments, trends, and challenges in ensuring the safety of our food supply through analytical techniques, uncovering the science behind what makes our food safe and delicious.
Welcome to another episode of Analytically Delicious. My name is David Steiner, and today we are diving deep into the world of food safety regulations and contaminants, an area that directly affects what we eat every day. While most consumers rarely think about the hidden dangers in their food, experts in regulatory science work tirelessly to assess risks and ensure that what reaches our plates is safe. To help us unravel this complex field, we have a special guest, Dr. Mari Eskola. Mari has spent over a decade at the European Food Safety Authority, where she worked on regulatory risk assessments for contaminants in food and feed. She has also contributed to EU food legislation and novel food approvals. Today she leads the regulatory science and reports team at Medfiles in Finland, where she continues to bridge the gap between scientific research and food law compliance. In this episode, we will explore how contaminants are regulated, why some substances are banned while others are tolerated, and what challenges arise when aligning regulations between the EU, US, and other global markets. Now grab your headphones and join us as we uncover the science behind food safety regulations. Hello, Mari. Welcome to our show. It's really a pleasure to have you here today.
Hi, David. Thank you for the invitation indeed.
So, Mari, usually we start with a very short icebreaker question, and given your background in regulatory science, if you had to design a completely new food safety rule for fun, what would it be?
Well, can it really be a rule if it doesn't involve any red tape? That's my first question. So I guess there is always bureaucracy if there is a rule. But I think we should order by law all to trust to each other. Then no rules are needed for food safety sector, because that's really the propagating the trust. In Europe, in fact, the trust is the lowest to the food industry, and only around 50% of the people in the Europeans trust the authorities and scientists. So it's not too good. So I think that kind of rule would be really nice indeed.
Absolutely. Yeah, fully agree. Switching gears now. Marie, you have spent years assessing food contaminants at EFSA. And for everybody who is not aware about this institution, it's basically an organization in the European Union that checks if the food we eat is safe. So they don't really make laws, but they give advice to governments in Europe to help them making good decisions about food safety. Based on that fact, can you walk us through a little bit the key steps of a regulatory risk assessment for food contaminants?
Yes, I can do that. I worked at EFSA for 10 years, so I should know something, and particularly in the contaminants unit. First, of course, there needs to be a public health concern for certain contaminant. So that means that it needs to cause a potential hazard for a large number of people in the EU. This means that it needs to occur often in the diet at those levels that it can cause adverse effects. So before anything can be done, we need to know the occurrence data and then concentrations in the foods. And only then we can do risk assessment. And then if we have those data first, then the risk assessment parts are hazard identification, where we indeed describe the hazard. Then we have a hazard characterization, which is basically the tox part, where we discuss the toxicological data. And then we do a dietary exposure assessment based on the occurrence data and the concentrations. And here also the food consumption data are needed in order to calculate the dietary exposure. And then finally we have the fourth part, which is the risk characterization part, in which the hazard is quantified first, for example, by setting a health-based guidance value, like a tolerable daily intake, TDI, or if this is for the chronic hazards or chronic toxicity, or if the contaminant is causing acute toxicity, like, for example, dioxynivalenol may cause vomiting, then we set an acute reference dose. And then these values are then compared to the exposure estimates. And that that is the risk characterization. So there we characterize the risk. Then we also need to remember that if there is not enough robust data to calculate TDI or acute reference dose or so forth, or the substance is genotoxic, carcinogenic, then no health-based guidance value like TDI or RFD can be derived. And then we do a margin of exposure. That's just simply calculated, and it's calculated between the identified reference dose for toxicity and compared to the exposure. That's the risk assessment bit. And then after all this, the risk communication is done together, usually with the European Food Safety Authority and the European Commission. So that's the way.
Okay. And what are some of the most common contaminants in food today, and how do they end up there, and how do regulators decide on safety thresholds for these contaminants?
I think the usual suspects, like heavy metals, dioxin like PCBs, also mycotoxins and food process contaminants. The heavy metals they are just coming to food from the environment, so they are either anthropological use or they are environmental contaminants. And then dioxins are a bit the same. They are also coming from the anthropological use, or they can be natural also in the environment, maybe due to the burning of the bushes or forest fires and so forth. And like PCBs, naturally. Mycotoxins, those many of us know, they are produced by molds in foods and feeds. And then food process contaminants, as the name says, they occur or form during the food processing. And then I got a bit puzzled with your word safety threshold. So if you refer by the safety threshold to the EU maximum levels, then there we need to remember that the maximum levels are not necessarily protective. They are not safety levels. So we need to remember, for example, aflatoxin or arsenic, which are genotoxic carcinogens, that the maximum levels which the EU has set for those, or US FDA has set for those, they are not protective. But in the maximum level setting, let's say the member states and Commission in Europe and US it's FDA, they consider also the analytical methods that they need to be available. They also consider that the socioeconomic factors. I mean, they think that whether if they set the maximum level too low, whether then that means something as regards to the availability of foods or possibly a loss of jobs. So all these aspects they take into account. And naturally, of course, they take into account the authorities' opinion, like in this case, EFSA's opinion. So member states and commission together then decide, they take into account the EFSA opinion, all these factors when they are establishing the maximum level. So it's not only that they look at the EFSA opinion, they think it and consider many other aspects. And then they also consider which is the vulnerable group to be protected, because not all people can be protected, but we can see from the legislation that usually the most vulnerable group are the children and babies, so those are always protected, but naturally also most of us are protected with the maximum levels. But let's say that every single individual, because we are all different, we may also have our own health issues and so forth. Everyone cannot be protected by the EU maximum level. But most of the people, most of us, yes. So we are all fine in that regard.
That sounds very good. Thank you for that great overview. Maybe just to add a comment for those substances you mentioned with a genotoxic potential, carcinogenic potential. So the EU there follows the so-called ALARA principle, right? So as low as reasonable, achievable, and as you said correctly, there is no protective limit, but at least we try the best to keep these substances out of our food, and as low as possible. So, Marie, you have experience with both European Union and US food regulations, right? So how do their approaches to food safety and contaminants actually differ?
The simple answer to this one is that US typically has higher maximum levels. And the EU is the most stringent one. So they have the most stringent food regulations. But otherwise, both of its jurisdictions, they want to protect their populations naturally. So But then we also need to remember that the US authorities, they work a little bit differently from the EU in many ways. And they engage a lot more with the food industry directly. They want to discuss with them, and they want to provide scientific advice directly to the companies. For example, if the company wants to authorize a new food or new feed, they provide the advice directly, not like in the EU where we need to read the guidance documents. So this is a little bit different, and in a way it makes at least in my view, because I work in both jurisdictions, this makes the authorization of the, let's say, novel foods or any other stuff in the US much smoother. The US is not called novel food; it's called GRAS rather, but it makes it the entire authorization process faster because there is a direct contact with the authority.
Yeah, it sounds much more straightforward. Definitely.
Indeed. Here is a different story. Yeah.
And are there specific contaminants that are banned in the EU but still allowed in the US, or also vice versa?
I don't think there is I don't think whether you really can ban any food contaminants directly because they are unintentionally present in the food. Yeah. But regulated products like hormones, the use of hormones in the meat production, or the ban of chloride spray to reduce the microbiological contamination in the carcasses in the US, those are banned in the EU. So that's the let's say, I would say the ban, let's say the easy examples of the banned let's say residues in this case. But contaminants, I don't think it's not an easy way to ban because they are just
Sure. But on the basis on the regulatory differences you already mentioned at the beginning, how does these differences impact the international food trade?
Yeah, that's a good question. If you think about the hormones I just mentioned in the meat production, that certainly means something that the EU doesn't allow that sort of meat to come to EU. So that's the thing. US cannot sell that to EU. And that also means at the European level that there are annual surveys for the food in every single member state. They include always hormone analysis, the banned substances. So they need to always analyze those. It also means a lot of work, a lot of money, because you need to develop methods, you need to have a standards and so forth, and staff and so on. And also, to my understanding, there are also, I remember from my past when I worked in the Finnish Food Safety Authority and Irish Food Safety Authority, there are also inspections. The US guys are coming over to EU to see, okay, how is Finnish authority doing this and that? How is the Irish authority analyzing this and that and doing this and that? So I think it's vice versa. I think the EU guys are also going to the US doing their inspections there.
Understand, yeah. And with the international trade growing, the regulatory differences between regions create really challenges for food producers and safety assessments. So in your experience, what are the biggest obstacles to global harmonization of food safety standards, and do you see a realistic path forward?
No, I don't think that's ever really going to happen. Because we need to think also that people are eating different foods. The diets are different. Yeah. So that means that there needs to be different standards in different countries. But what I know that the big companies like Nestlé and Mondelez and so forth, these guys are often following the EU regulation because those are the most stringent. And they say that, first of all, it's more expensive to kind of produce different kind of foods with the different levels. I mean, regulatory levels. So it's easy just to produce same food with one level type of levels and then sell it to everywhere. And they also say that it's advantage if the levels are the lowest, they protect their customers the most. If they, I mean, when they are EU levels, then they say that they protect their customers the most.
Marie, you already mentioned the term novel foods, and we know that this kind of food are becoming more and more common. So from lab-grown meat to insect protein. How do regulatory bodies ensure their safety before they reach the consumers?
Well, that's an easy answer. With the full risk assessment by the authorities. That's it.
Thank you. A quick one. Very good.
Yes. Well, of course, the applicant needs to send all the document and data to the burden is on the applicant, the burden is on the industry, but then the authorities make it sure that it's safe and they give their opinion whether they think it's safe or not.
Okay. And are there specific cases where a novel food was denied approval due to safety concerns? Do you have an example?
I don't think there are any specific cases, but there are many cases where the novel foods were not considered safe by the authorities. So there are many cases, and usually so the evidence is just not enough to show that the food is safe. So that's usually the or typically the outcome why the novel food doesn't enter to the market.
What we know is food safety regulations are based on rigorous scientific assessments, and yet public perception often differs. So think of concerns about pesticides, GMOs, or artificial additives. So how do regulators balance scientific evidence with customer fears when shaping policies?
I think that's a difficult topic because I guess the only way to do that is there is communication and do it in a way that the people would understand with a really layman kind of a way of doing that. I was doing lots of risk communication at EFSA as well, and it's a really tricky issue. So this is how to do it, but it's also I also think that there should be more training, education, and then really a clear communication, not to scare off too much, but also to express the facts and tell the facts. So that's the issue, and certainly it's more difficult nowadays when we have the social media where all kind of information is going around.
Yeah, that's definitely true, but I think public awareness is very important in this respect, and the policies should definitely do a lot of efforts in this case. Also related to a lot of efforts, what happens when a contaminant is found in a food product that is already on the market? What does the regulatory response typically look like?
It depends if the contaminant is one which has already statutory levels established. Then the food needs to be discarded either by the food company itself, if it finds it in its own regular in-house inspection, or then the order comes from the local food inspector, and then it kind of needs to be recalled. If it doesn't have established maximum levels, then the companies kind of have in a way two options. One option is to carry out risk assessment and then keep it on the market. But on the other hand, I would say often what I have seen, the companies just decide to recall it because it's faster and it doesn't have doesn't cause any harm to their reputation than to do actual risk assessments. But they do quick risk assessment, and sometimes also in my current work we have got some requests for doing a risk assessment for that kind of cases.
And are there any past cases where a food recall prevented a major health crisis? Can we estimate that?
I don't think there are kind of many cases where the European Commission took actions in order to prevent any big health crisis, but those relate to more like a mad cow disease or so forth. There was a dioxin crisis long time ago in Ireland and also in Italy, where there was a dioxin found in Italian buffalo mozzarella. But I don't know whether these were really recalled from the market, but there were EFSA opinion requested, and then there was a discussion on how to proceed. But I think the food recalls occur all the time, so there are all the time recalls, and I think mainly, of course, due to the microbiological contamination, and also due to the physical objects found in the food, like bits of metal or bits of glass or this and that. Also, sometimes I think pesticides might be something because they are intense. They are kind of allowed to be used in the foods, so there could be higher levels.
Yeah, I remember there was the fipronil scandal in the eggs in Belgium.
Yeah, exactly. So those things.
And how does EFSA or other regulators actually communicate risks effectively to the public? I mean, you mentioned social media. Is this a way how EFSA is maybe communicating?
Yeah, EFSA is communicating through the their websites, and they have the press releases, and then I remember myself going to the various events to talk about the outcomes of the risk assessment, and that's the way how it's done. And also it's done in the, let's say, not necessarily big public, but it's done to the member state representatives in the EU, in the commission meeting. So in that way, it's said around. Yeah.
So we are almost coming to an end, but I want also to raise one additional question with respect to climate change. So we know that climate change is massively affecting agricultural conditions. And what we see is that there are new patterns in food contamination, especially in the area of mycotoxins, in regions where they were previously more or less rare. So how are regulators preparing for these emerging risks?
Yeah, that's really, I think, the challenge of our lifetime. Really a big thing, really a big challenge. And as you mentioned, it mainly impacts not necessarily mainly, but one of the big area of the contaminants is really the natural toxins like mycotoxins and also marine biotoxins, because the seas are getting warmer, and but also other contaminants like heavy metals, because let's say if you think about the floods in Spain just recently, when the large areas are contaminated with flood water, of course there can be dioxin spread over, the heavy metals spread over within the water, or the forest and bushfires and all those things may cause dioxin contamination, PAH contamination, and so forth. What EFSA is doing, and the European Commission as well together, they have an emerging risk task force, at EFSA even has emerging risk working group. So that they are discussing the possible emerging risk, because the emerging risk can be new risk, old risk in the new place, or completely new risk. So there are various types of emerging risk. So that's it's done. And in fact, there are already really tangible, let's say, outcomes how regulators have kind of approached this risk. EFSA has several opinions on mycotoxins, where it really asked EFSA, and I was at the time at EFSA. Commission asked us to evaluate that if they increase the maximum level of certain contaminant, how much more risk there would be for the general public. So I think this is something that's going to happen in the future. So I think these food authorities, Commission, among with them, they need to kind of have some sort of trade. They need to start thinking that, okay, if you don't have food, let's say like cereals, which are very important food. So whether we should increase the maximum level in order to have that food. So I think these were some examples we already had. So, but I personally think that this is going to happen more and more in the future.
And do you think regulatory frameworks are keeping up with the advancements in food technology?
Yeah, I think so. And let's say if you think about the novel food regulation and GMO regulation, those are kind of the regulations which take into consideration the new stuff. Also new food additives, I would say. But so I think pretty well, because if you think about the technological advances, so these two regulations consider that and particularly in the novel food regulation, but also GMO, if there are new techniques used, like GM technique or novel food regulation, if there is a new food technological system used in the factory, then that impacts that the food could be a novel food, and that needs to be assessed by EFSA. So I think in that regard, yes, that the safety will be assessed by the authority. But there are big concerns. If you think about cell-cultured meat, for example, or other new alternative proteins for insects and so forth, or genetically modified plants, then the big challenges are that we don't know about necessarily their allergens. We don't know the allergenicity of the new proteins, the alternative completely new proteins. And even EFSA doesn't know, the scientific community doesn't know how to analyze new proteins for their allergenic potential, so that we don't know yet. So there's a big job for the scientists to do.
Absolutely, I fully agree.
New nice methods. I'm looking forward to those.
Yeah, me too. So, Marie, before we wrap up, is there one myth or common misconception about food safety regulations that you would like to debunk? I think now is the chance.
Yeah, I think I already a little bit hinted above before during our discussion that I think the most common myth is that everyone thinks that the maximum levels the authority is setting, whether it's in the EU or US or Singapore or wherever, that would protect every single individual. And I already mentioned before that it's not the case. Most of us are protected, but not all single person. So that's the thing. But anyhow, most of us are protected, so I consider that we are all fine and we can eat our food in peace. We don't need to worry.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that conclusion. And a huge thank you to you, Marie, for sharing your extensive expertise with us. I think your insights have given us a clearer picture of how food safety regulations work behind the scenes and how scientific risk assessments shape the policies that protect consumers worldwide. So what we have learned today highlights an important takeaway. Food safety is a continuous process requiring a rigorous scientific evaluation, but also proactive regulation and international collaboration. While food contamination risks will always exist, as we have figured out already, the stringent regulatory frameworks are in place, especially in Europe, and this helps to ensure that customers can trust the food they buy, and I think that's a very important take-home message. But in general, the conversation doesn't stop here. Food safety is an evolving field with new challenges emerging due to climate change and also technological advancements and shifting consumer demands. So the way we regulate contaminants today will shape the future of global food trade and public health. And thank you for tuning in. And until next time, stay safe and stay informed. Thank you, Marie.
Thank you very much, David. It was a pleasure.
If you found today's conversation as enlightening as we did and want to stay informed about future episodes, remember to subscribe to our podcast on Spotify or YouTube. By subscribing, you'll never miss a bite of our delicious insights into food safety and analysis. And for those of you with burning questions or lingering curiosities related to our today's episode or any other food safety topic, don't hesitate to contact service at lva.at. Your questions will be addressed either directly in our next episode or by our team of experts on our website, www.lva.at. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time, stay safe and stay informed.